presentation. I'm Helen Wilson, Vice President of the Squirrel Hill Historical Society, and unfortunately our President, Jim Hammond, and our two program schedulers, Todd Miller and Toby Chapman, couldn't be here tonight. So I'll do the welcomes, and first I would like to introduce our board members who are present. We have Tony Indovina, who's our email coordinator, Alex Musicant, who is our wonderful tech person. Get the list. Rod Parmesan, I always get it confused, I'm sorry, Rod Parmesan. Say it for us.
Parmigiani?
Parmigiani.
I will memorize it tonight, never give up. And Rod is our treasurer. Is Stanley here tonight? Stanley Klein is our membership coordinator. Let's see. Audrey Glickman, who is our media specialist. She does the taping. Our website webmaster is Janine Michael, who is not here. And Todd Wilson has not come yet. Oh, he did come. There he is over there. Another board member. And let's see, do I have everybody? I do want to introduce Agnes and Drew, who are helping us at the information table. And thank you. This way. Okay, that light. Okay, and I just have two announcements. Thank you. Okay. Well, one is that if you're a Squirrel Hill Historical Society member, or if you've been, there was an article in the Post-Gazette that we've been working on the Shenley Park City Designated Historic Site nomination, and we went to a hearing last week. It was for the Historic Review Commission, and it was the hearing approved, the commission approved the Shenley Park nomination unanimously, and also the Anathan House on Murray Avenue, that was another one that was nominated. Both have been approved, and the next step is to go before City Council, and if they approve it, then they do have city designated historic status, which is a really big deal. So, the second thing is, on June 22nd, we are inviting Squirrel Hill Historical Society members to come to the Neil Log House on a day that it's open to everybody. So if you're not a member, you can still go on that day and have the tour. Our park ranger is running the show now, and she's wonderful. We might have, or we're planning to have a few special perks for members who come. So anyway, that's June 22nd from 12 to 3. And if you want to remember that, there's these little notes on the table over there, so you can just pick one up, put it on your calendar, and hope it's a day like this, in the rain. So, okay, I think those are, any other, no, okay. So, I usually don't read from a script, but these are so wonderful, I am going to read your introductions. A native of Pittsburgh, James Wudarczyk is the author or co-author of 15 books, has contributed more than 425 articles and reviews to various newsletters, publications, and websites. He's a local tour guide and a lecturer. In addition to being a member of the Squirrel Hill Historical Society, Jim is also the vice president of the Lawrenceville Historical Society, a member of the Greater Pittsburgh Civil War Roundtable, secretary of the Holy Name Society of St. Pio of Petricina Parish, and was recently named to the board of directors of the Catholic Historical Society of Western Pennsylvania. Tonight, Jim and Joann will address the topic of Pittsburgh's orphans and orphanages. And for Joann, the second speaker, or first? Second. Human interest writer Joann Cantrell is a Pittsburgh native who has worked for newspapers and magazines and is an award-winning local journalist. With a genuine interest in hearing narratives and the desire to write, share, and preserve the stories of people's lives, she is the author of 3 books for the Arcadia Publishing Images of America series, each celebrating the history of neighborhoods, towns, and cities across the country. Legendary Locals of Pittsburgh, Lawrenceville, and the new book, Pittsburgh Orphans and Orphanages. She has also authored the book, Carried Within Me, Echoes of Infant Loss, which is published by Lighthouse Point Press, which is Pittsburgh. The book features the intimate narratives of bereaved mothers and fathers who have lost an infant, some recently and others who experienced their loss decades ago. As a mother who lost infant twins, Joann understands that infant loss is carried within for a lifetime and wrote this poignant book to help parents realize that they are not alone in their grief. And now I would like to present our speakers, Jim and Joann.
Okay, thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your kind invitation to be here this evening as we briefly look at Pittsburgh's Orphans and Orphanages. I have to admit that prior to 2021, I did not give very much thought to the topic, even though my house is only located a half a block from a former orphanage. Then one evening I received a call from Joann Cantrell, with whom I had co-authored a book back in 2015. Joann is a wonderful person. I truly love her, but she cannot start a telephone conversation with, "Hi, how are you doing?" They start with, "I have an idea for a book." And that's where our story begins today. Now, my first encounter with the subject of orphanages was a number of years ago when a friend of mine was visiting a Capuchin Franciscan friar in the Brookline section of Pittsburgh. And the friary actually looked like an old castle. Father Dennis told me at one time it was the home of Toner Institute. In 1899, Dr. James L. Toner of Westmoreland County bequeathed $140,000 and his family farm to be used as an orphanage for Catholic boys in order to teach them farming skills. Then, in 1914, Toner pretty much reinvents itself and moves to Brookline, where it expanded tremendously. Initially, the Westmoreland orphanage only housed 16 boys, but again, after they moved to Brookline, it goes through a tremendous expansion. By World War II, there's a lot of emphasis placed on military drill and discipline. So Toner again starts reinventing itself along the lines of the military concept. By 1970, the population of Toner dropped to 47, so it was time for another reinvention. This time, they decided that they would cater to boys with emotional problems. 7 years later, they ran into severe financial problems and they had to close their doors. The book was actually dedicated to Margaret Shaw, who was the inspiration for this project, but I'll let Joann tell you about her. In October 2022, the book finally came out, and it was divided into 2 parts. The first part looks at some of the institutions and where they were located and a little history of them. And the second part of the book really deals with some of the people that came through these institutions. Now, before getting into our topic tonight, I want to regress a little bit and tell you how I met Joann. Back in 2014, she gave a presentation before the Lawrenceville Historical Society on the topic of her first book, Legendary Locals of Pittsburgh. At that meeting, she said, "I'm going to write another Arcadia book, and this one is going to deal with Lawrenceville. I congratulated her on a fine presentation, and I wished her the best of luck. Surprisingly, the next day she called me with some questions about Lawrenceville, and before we hung up the phone, we were co-authoring a book. Now, the weird part about this is we were total strangers, and we came from totally different backgrounds. Yet, somehow, we managed to learn to work together and come out with a book, and it was the book that I had the most fun doing. When we were working on our first book on Lawrenceville, it was easy to get appointments, and our various institutions opened their archives. This was not the case when we were working on the orphans book, because this was the period of COVID. Most of our work had to be done via email or the telephone. When Joann and I met once in person, we could not find a single place in downtown Pittsburgh to have lunch or even grab a donut and coffee. I even had to make an appointment to use the Oakland Carnegie Library. Plus, people were very slow in getting us photographs. There was a high level of frustration, and we really didn't think we would be able to pull the book off. After the final copy was sent to Arcadia, Joann told me that she was ready to throw in the towel, but she had a conversation with a former editor of the Post-Gazette, and he said, "This is too important of a subject to abandon." About a month before our deadline, we had several lucky breaks, and we wound up with more pictures than we needed for the book. So what constitutes an orphan? In some cases, a child may have lost both parents. Other cases, one where both parents might have been still living, but because of dire financial straits, they were not able to keep their children. They thought that if they put them in an orphanage, at least they'll have a roof over their head and food on the table. And the third classification had to do with babies being left on the doorstep of a hospital because there was a social stigma attached to being an unwed mother. So while there was a tremendous need for orphanages, we can make a great case to say these are really not great places to raise children. But you have to ask yourself, what was the alternative? Did you want to see children living on the streets, children starving, or children getting into trouble with the law or being victimized? The first orphanage appears in Pittsburgh in 1832, and it was founded by the First Presbyterian Church. Most of the orphanages in Pittsburgh and around the Pittsburgh area were actually run by religious institutions or beneficial societies. Orphanages usually accommodated between 50 and 60 people, and sometimes they could accommodate as many as 100 children. Some orphanages actually operated trade schools, but the primary function of most of these institutions was merely to provide shelter and food for the children. Since most of the orphanages had very large rooms with long lines of beds, there was very little room for privacy and absolutely no room for individualism. By 1900, there were more than 100,000 orphans in the United States living in these institutions. Children were often segregated by race, gender, and religious denomination. Now keep in mind that in 1900, the total population of the United States was 76.3 million, so having 100,000 orphans is really a tremendous problem. Fortunately, again, it's the churches, synagogues, and beneficial societies that step up to help these children. In July 1883, Concordia House was founded on a farm near Marwood, Pennsylvania. The home would not accept any child under the age of 2, and when you turned 18, you were released from the home. The home was sponsored by the Evangelical Lutheran Church, and a parent could redeem their child from the institution if they could demonstrate that their financial situation changed and that they could provide a stable Christian home. Now, boys were assigned tasks like milking cows, taking care of the animals, taking care of the harvest, and they were also assigned the very labor-intensive chores. Older girls worked in the laundry and the kitchen, as well as taking care of the younger children. By the time Concordia closed its doors in 1958, it had served 1,000 orphans. Now, it should be noted that the concept of moving children from the city out to the country had an interesting side purpose. And they believed that by getting children into fresh air, it would reduce the risk of consumption and tuberculosis. As I noted, many of these orphanages were segregated by race. The Home for Colored Children was no exception. It was founded in 1880 by a Presbyterian minister, Reverend James Fullerton. And he found a 5-year-old girl roaming the streets all by herself with no one to care for her. Moved with pity for the little child, he took her into his own home. Later, he expanded that ministry, and by 1900, the Home for Colored Children was serving 55 black orphans. This home moved several times. Today, the Three Rivers Youth Agency does not operate an orphanage, but it's really an offspring of the Home for Colored Children. And today, this agency offers social services to more than 5,500 individuals and families each year. Now, in many cases, as soon as a boy turned 12 years of age, he was released from the home and told, fend for yourself and find a job. Now, can you imagine throwing a 12-year-old boy out into the street? Yet, in 1885, this was very common. In order to provide food and shelter for these youngsters, the Pittsburgh Newsboys Home was founded. It soon enjoyed the support of the public, the Pittsburgh Press, Mary Shenley, and Christopher McGee. Now, while living at the home, the boys were taught skills in order to secure employment in the printing and machine shop trades. It's not every day that you get to meet the President of the United States. Yet in 1962, President John Kennedy was doing a tour of Western Pennsylvania, and he went by Emsworth, where Holy Family Institute was located. Many of the young children, the orphans there, came out to meet the president. They presented him with a doll for his daughter, Caroline. When you hear the name Jacob Mark Gusky, you can't help but think of philanthropist and retail merchant. What's interesting about Mr. Gusky is that not only did he care about taking care of Jewish orphans, he was dubbed the Jewish Santa Claus because on Christmas, during the course of his life, he distributed more than 3,000 gifts to children in various orphanages. The Gusky Home was founded in 1891 on Perrysville Avenue on the north side. By 1920, the facility could accommodate 100 children. By 1939, there was a proposal to merge the Gusky Home and Orphanage with the Jewish Home for Babies and Children. The initiative never got off the ground because Gusky believed that children should be placed in foster homes, while the Jewish home thought that they should be provided for within an institutionalized setting. In April 1832, as mentioned, we do have our first orphanage in Pittsburgh. This was the Protestant Orphan Asylum of Pittsburgh and Allegheny. In the early 1900s, it changed its name to the Protestant Orphan Home, and it would only care for true orphans. A second orphanage on the north side was founded in 1861 and was known as the Home for the Friendless. This home looked after children who were being abused and neglected. In 1884, we find that the Sisters of Charity started a ministry to care not only for abandoned babies, but also for unwed mothers.
They had 60 beds and a waiting list of 100 women. In 1891, they started a foundling asylum, and in the first 6 months, they cared for 64 abandoned babies. The Pittsburgh Home for Babies was founded in 1904 by a group of women who were influenced by the Nobel Prize winner Jane Addams, who received an award for her work in social work. The home was considered by 1931 as a model because it had a paid staff of nurses, pediatricians, and specialists. Also, the nurses were well known for the tender, loving care that they gave infants and orphans. Now, if you look at the next slide, you will see that it's not uncommon for little children to crave attention. And they're like any other small children. Since they do not, in orphanages, you usually did not receive the amount of attention that you would receive in a home environment. Sister Antonio of the Sisters of Nazareth, who ran Holy Family Institute, literally adopted all these small children that were under her care and showered them with as much love as attention as she could possibly give. By 1948, there was a change in concept of orphans and orphanages. By 1948, it was widely recognized that orphanages were inhibiting emotional development of children and youth. So starting in 1947, there was a push to place orphans with relatives or in foster homes. By 1970, the early 1970s, this alternative seemed to be working so well that you found very few orphanages left anywhere in the United States. As noted, orphanages often moved to different locations and at times changed their names. Throughout the history of these institutions, there was oftentimes a move to modernize the facilities. As the case of St. Anthony Village, the grounds were actually repurposed. St. Anthony Village closed as an orphanage in 1953 and later reopened as the St. Anthony School for Exceptional Children. Here you see a modern building on the grounds of St. Paul's Orphanage in the Crafton section of Pittsburgh, known as Bishop O'Connor Hall. This structure was built in 1956. In conclusion, I just want to tell you that if your phone ever rings and you see Joann's number pop up, if you don't feel like writing a book, don't answer the phone.
First, I want to thank Jim, my partner in crime, who writes these books with me, and I really couldn't do it without him. He does a great job of doing all the history, and I write about the people. And as Jim said, this all started, I grew up, my maternal grandmother was an orphan at the Oddfellows Orphanage, which was on the north side. It started out in the Ben Avon area, and my whole life I heard stories about it, but I didn't write about it until my grandmother had passed away. And it started out with just a feature story in the Post-Gazette in 2010. And at that time, I was just writing from memory about the stories of my grandmother growing up in the orphanage. And what I had no idea, I was overwhelmed. At the end of the article, they always gave the author's email. And I literally heard from hundreds of people who were raised in the orphanage. And this was 2010, so they were all octogenarians, some of them in their 90s, and they were getting close to finishing out their time here on Earth, and I tried to capture their stories as much as I could, but now it's their descendants that helped provide some of the background stories. So the first one is my grandmother, and she's the little toddler on the knee of her grandfather. She's with her grandparents. Her mother's in the background holding her baby sister, and her brother is in the front, and she had 2 older sisters. Her mother was left a widow at age 32 in 1920, and her husband had been a member of the Oddfellows organization that had a benefit that if you were an Oddfellow, your widows, your orphans would be looked after. So it became kind of an insurance policy where they would take care of any widows who were left behind, and she didn't have the means to take care of all of her children. So the 3 smallest, my grandmother being the one on the knee, her brother and her baby sister went to the Oddfellows orphanage. This is a photograph that I saw on my grandmother's dresser till the day she died of her family, and it always kind of tugged at my heart because it's the semblance, or it gives an idea or an illusion of a family, but they never lived together as a family because the 3 youngest went to the orphanage as toddlers and stayed there till they were 18, with very few visits to her mother. And there's the Oddfellows home in Ben Avon that started out, and then the one on your right is the future one, which was state-of-the-art in the 20s when it was built. And it became the Art Rooney Middle School, part of the Pittsburgh public school system. And again, there's through the years, my grandmother would go back and visit her siblings and her mother, but it was never for a very long period of time. So they never lived together as a family. These were some of the other orphans that were labeled as home kids, but they became closer than siblings. They lived a communal life together in quarters their entire childhood and through their teenage years. They formed friendships and tight bonds. And these photos, you can barely see that the boys' names are written on them. My grandmother and her sister kept a scrapbook, and these were the photos that were in the scrapbook. There's my grandmother standing outside of the orphanage, and then that is her when she was married and starting her adult life. What Jim and I found was it was so common that, I always felt sorry for my grandmother as an orphan, thinking, what a sad situation. It was very common. Another woman that we got to know through doing the book was Christine Zagel, and she was at St. Paul's in modern times, in the 50s. And, she left the orphanage and she was placed with a foster family who mistreated her. And in a twist of fate, she found a family who kind of adopted her and took her in. And the family that she always hoped for as a little girl, she got later in life. There's a picture of her on the beach with her children and her grandchildren. She lived life to the fullest. She loved her family, animals. She was a bike rider, and she was so influenced by her time in the orphanage that she became a court-appointed special advocate. They call them CASA. Striving to make a difference in the life of children who are abused or neglected. She passed away in 2020 from ALS. Another man was Joseph Harrier, who was at the Home for the Friendless. I still can't say that name without feeling sad. Like, you lived in the Home for the Friendless. How sad is that? But as a young boy, when he was 14, him and his sibling went there, and he was in the newspaper. You can see businessmen treat orphans to the circus. And there was Lee Powell was a actor who played the Lone Ranger, and he was there for the boys for a photo shoot. But Joseph Harrier had very bad circumstances at home and ended up in the orphanage. He had the stigma of being an orphan, which was an overwhelming burden, but he was quick to make friends, and had an easygoing personality. And later in life, he met his wife, Mary Louise, and when he was 26, they married on New Year's Day in 1955. And they were blessed with 3 children, and he learned to provide a home that had stability and security and the love that was sorely lacking in his own life as a child. I just wanted to put this picture in. Jim mentioned that one of the orphanages was very close to where he lives. This is at the corner of Penn Avenue and 40th Street in Lawrenceville. It was the Episcopal home, and in the 1860s, it was a shelter for widows and orphans. And I just love this picture because there's old women that were widows. They cared for the orphans were cared by them, and it was a multi-intergenerational operation that the kids had adopted grandparents and the senior citizens had children to look after. There was St. Anthony's, where you can see how all the orphans were dressed alike. They were groomed alike. Even the girls had short hair because it was easier to take care of. There were orphans such as the Kennedy children. In the center, a man named Ron Todd, and on the end, a guy in the center is Jim Slay. They were all testimony to the lasting imprints that living in an orphanage helped them to overcome obstacles later in their life. Children who were raised in the orphanage became models of strength and perseverance, even though they were raised in an institutional setting, and it gave them a sense of a place to call home that they didn't have. Their stories are all like my grandmother's stories, and they remain an important part of Pittsburgh's history. And that's it. If we do questions and answers, if anybody has any.
I wondered where the first Rosalia foundling was located. The first one.
I'm trying to think, I know we have it in the book. I'm pretty sure it was in the Hill District. One of the things I think we forget, that the Pittsburgh Hill District at one time was very eclectic. You listen now, it's always about blacks and jazz, but it was really multiracial, multi-ethnic, and they had quite a few institutions that actually got their start up there, plus most of them were very small, and then as pointed out, oftentimes they expanded into something much, much larger. Okay. Sure. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, you were talking about that orphanages were run by religious institutions. Were there also state institutions in the early days, or is that?
Yes, there were municipal. For example, the very earliest, while it was actually run by the Presbyterian Church, the city, the courts in Allegheny County and Allegheny City would actually place orphans in these institutions. Yes, sir.
Since none of these orphanages exist now, where did you find all this wonderful data about each one?
I have to give credit not to our research, but to that of the Carnegie Library in Oakland. One of the projects they did was compile a list of not only orphanages, but various types of institutions. And they published a small book on it. And we literally went through and started picking out where the orphanages were. And then we had to backtrack and find, well, are there any pictures? And if so, who will give them to us? For example, Holy Family Institute. Sister Linda up there is a wonderful woman, a great administrator, but she was afraid to give any pictures because she was afraid they would be used for derogatory purposes. And I says, Sister, I'm a practicing Catholic and a holy name man. She said, how many pictures do you want?
Also, there's 3. The Home for the Colored Children is now the Three Rivers Youth Association. So it's continual to change, but it's originated from that. And the Home for the Friendless is Presley Ridge, which is still in existence. And the country home, one of them was in Zelienople. Glade Run it is today, but it was founded by Passavant, and that was the Zelienople farm home. So there's 3 that we had in the book that are still in operation. They're under a different name. Another one?
Or, yeah, the St. Anthony School for Exceptional Children is being operated right now at Sacred Heart School in Shadyside, East Liberty area. And that actually started in Oakmont, PA. Yes, sir.
Can I note that the Gusky Home is now Jewish Family and Community Services?
Okay.
Oh, that's right, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
You said there was a Catholic historical research?
Catholic Historical Society of Western Pennsylvania. They publish a magazine that's, I consider very scholarly. It's usually over my head. But they put it out once a year, and they do an excellent job of documenting such things as priests who served in parishes. One issue dealt with St. Michael's Seminary, which is no longer in existence. They do a lot of various articles relating to Catholic history in Pittsburgh.
Where's it located?
They don't have a home per se. Their archives are at the Catholic Archives in Crafton, is that now, Joann?
Mm-hmm.
Crafton, and the other place that they're using is Duquesne University Library.
Thank you.
So we have 4
Yes, sir.
questions from Zoom. So are there orphanages today? You answered part of that.
As far as I know, no.
Was there a Catholic orphanage in Lawrenceville around 1910?
Yes, it was I think it was actually closer to 1930 and closed sometime in the early 1950s. It was the Rayfield Temporary Home, and that was roughly between 38th and 37th Street along Penn Avenue. Tom Powers, who is the president of Lawrenceville Historical Society, and I once did a piece on that.
Are there any records on the names of children in the orphanages?
The Avonworth Historical Society does have some. Joanne's probably more qualified to answer that than I am.
Yeah, the Avonworth, Ben Avon Historical Society, they have, I was able to get my grandmother's report card from grade school through them. So they have records of students who went through the orphanages. And I think the University of Pittsburgh, or Carnegie Library, they have a directory they built that might have a way that you could look up if you had a relative there. That's a beginning point.
Yeah, I think one of the main things is oftentimes these records will not be released unless you can prove that you are a descendant of these people. Yes, ma'am.
Someone asked earlier about Rosalia. and
Yes.
Okay, it was originally, the very first was in a home closer to downtown in the lower hill. Then it moved up to Mid Hill on Webster. And then the last location was in Shadyside, that side street by the Greek Orthodox Church.
Is that Devon? Or Devonport?
No, it's not Devonshire.
Devonshire?
No, Atwood. But the other thing I wanted to mention is that when you were talking about the move toward foster care, my father and his siblings, my dad was 6 months old, when his father finished law school and the father and mother decided to split up. So he was born in 1929, and in the 30s and 40s and even through part of the 50s, the thinking was children should not be allowed to form an attachment. So they were moved from different orphanages and different foster homes. They never knew, they were not placed as siblings, but they got to see each other twice a year. And they never knew when the caseworker was going to show up on the playground, at school, at church, and they never got to take anything with them except the clothes that they were wearing. My father estimated that he was probably moved about 48 to 50 times.
Wow, that's terrible. Yes, sir.
We got a few more on Zoom.
Sure.
Many children in the Gusky home were orphaned by Johnstown flood. One was Lewis Kaplan, who became a judge. I guess I translate. Okay. Otherwise, do you know of the Cleveland Jewish orphanages? Cleveland Jewish Orphanage.
No, we just strictly looked at Pittsburgh because this, like so many topics of Pittsburgh history, has been shamefully neglected. And I have to say, if it wasn't for Joann, this project would have not gotten off the ground.
A few more. Were there any orphanages for just Irish children or immigrants?
I didn't come across that.
We haven't come across it, but most of them would have been related to, if they were Catholics, they would have been in a Catholic institution. If they were Irish Protestants, and believe it or not, there really are such a thing, they would have been put in something that catered to those denominations.
Last one. What kind of education did the children on the farm you described give? What were they given? How was their education?
As far as I can tell, everything was geared toward learning farming skills. Trade. Yeah. There was one of the orphanages in Troy Hill actually ran a trade school so that the boys could learn how to, various machine tools so they could go out and get jobs. But again, that's very rare to be running trade schools. Yes, ma'am.
When I was growing up in the 50s, my mother was involved with an organization called the Jewish Home for Babies and Children. And then it disappeared.
Again, after you start in 1948, they start phasing a lot of these institutions out, and by the 1970s, they're wiped off the map. That's why it's so important that the work that the Carnegie Library did in identifying where some of these institutions were. And I really think...
where that was?
No, I don't know.
The Carnegie Library's directory of orphanages would have it, because prior to 2000, you would look it up and it would just be no records, no records, no records. And the Oddfellows they have boxes and boxes of records, but it's in a warehouse in Grove City, and they said you're welcome to come and look, but they had no organization, no digital archive. It was like finding a needle in a haystack. So, some of the records are just not very well kept.
In addition to Oddfellows, there were other organizations which people, can remember. Their parents may have participated in the Elks, the Moose, the Eagles. All of those organizations also had orphanages that you did not have to be orphaned of both parents.
Yeah, just one.
One parent. And the same way with the Hershey School. Yeah, and the Hershey
Milton
School
Hershey School
still continues, and it's called Milton, but it was actually the wife who came up with the idea. And I had friends who were house parents there. So, these organizations took children from all over the country.
Right. Yeah.
We'll start with you, sir.
I noticed that your respondents, emphasized, the strength and the resilience they got out of that. Did any of them ever sort of address other issues of insecurity and not knowing how to parent, not how to function in a normal family?
I did phone interviews with, as I mentioned, over 100 people, and they were all, 80 years old plus at the time. My grandmother was deceased. And they shared their memories, and I would say more than 80% of them had a positive outlook on it. But there were a few that asked me if I would do an investigative story on abuse, whether it was through supervisors, superintendents, or other children. Like they were teenagers sharing, till they were 18, sharing, dormitories, and I'm sure there was some abuse there. I guess it was luck of the draw. Some people said they had wonderful masters and the caregivers, and other people said it was traumatic. They had terrible ones. So It was heartwarming to hear that the majority did say that despite the dire circumstance, they felt a sense of home and community, and they really did have close bonds with the people that they lived with throughout their growing up years.
Yes, sir.
Do these orphanages have their own schools, or do they attend Catholic schools, or public
Some
schools?
had their own
or
schools and some had to go out. For example, the Rayful Temporary Home, oftentimes they sent the children down to nearby St. Augustine's School. Usually they sent them to, if it was not a religious school, they would send them to the nearest public school. Yes, sir.
And you talked about Toner Institute originally, they had their own school program.
Yes, they did. But when they originally started back in 1899, it was to teach boys farming skills.
I was aware of Toner because I attended the Fall Institute, which was right next door.
Sure.
And we shared activities together.
Like I said, my experience here was very limited. The castle building, as I understand it, is still in Brookline today
For which building?
for the Toner Institute. Looks like an old castle.
Right. It's now a facility for unwed girls with small children.
Yes, ma'am, back there.
So if there was an overwhelmingly sort of positive experience, why were they shut down?
The idea was you did not want to have children in institutions. You wanted to place them in family environments. They thought that to get more nurturing, that there would be more emotional stability, more privacy, more of a chance to develop as individuals. Again, the foster home situation for some people was great, other people very nasty. Okay, any other questions? Yes, sir.
In Homestead, years ago, there was a building called the Oddfellows Building on 9th Avenue. Do you know if that was ever used as an orphanage? Do you know
That I don't know. I do know that the Oddfellows operated a number of homes throughout the Pittsburgh area.
And the United States.
And throughout the United States, yeah.
So at what point did government become involved in the regulation for children's protections, et cetera, and how did that change things?
We find it, like in 1959, they changed the national policies on how you tend to take care of children. I'm not sure how much before that it went, but we know that we can trace it back to at least 1959. Any other questions? Yes?
Two things. First of all, this is pre-pandemic, but at the Jewish Association on Aging on Browns Hill Road, there was a hall of history, of Jewish history, that did have some photos of the Home for Babies. I don't know if it's still there. They've gone through some changes, but it's a hall, long hall with photographs. And the second thing is, on Shady Avenue, the Children's Institute on very old maps was the industrial home for crippled children. That word industrial was in there. Do you know anything about that?
If I'm not mistaken, a lot of that had to do with taking care of children with tuberculosis and later polio. It was more of a hospital for children with medical conditions. Again, consumption and tuberculosis were an epidemic in Pittsburgh for many, many years. Okay, any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
There was a place in Shadyside, I think near Ivy Street, that had some designation about being an orphan home. Now it's turned it into there's a daycare center there. It's been there for like 15 or 20 years, but prior to that, it was some sort of home.
Okay, they were all over the place. I know somebody was telling me there was a home on Main Street in Lawrenceville, and while it was not designated as an orphanage, basically they took in so many foster children that it would pretty much constitute taking care of children that were orphaned. I do want to point out one more thing, in that this is really a subject that needs a lot more serious research. when you're dealing with an Arcadia book, these are cookie cutter books. They're very valuable because they preserve pictures that would not otherwise be made to the public, and that's an important part of our heritage. But they limit you to how many pictures per page, how many words per page. I mean, you can't go a period over that, and their editors will reject it. So I really do believe that there are these topics that need a lot more research. I know one day Joann received an inquiry on the St. Rita's Home for Babies, and she asked me to research it, and I put together a short paper for whoever asked it. But again, if you have to find the institution, you literally have to go through all the newspaper searches, and then you have to backtrack into where these institutions were, how they were financed, because this is all private money coming into them. And again, once the handful of people that run so many beneficial societies pass away, you know, there goes the good work they were doing. Any other questions? Okay, again, thank you very much for your kind invitation.
Thank you, Jim. And Joann had to leave early, but wow, you're right, this is a topic that can be expanded, and having written an Arcadia book, I know what you're talking about. And we're right now, if you get our newsletter, we're working on a book on Squirrel Hill street names, all 212 plus names, where they came from. So, you know, you get into that deep dive into history. So, but Jim has his books over there, and I didn't know, and also you have a
flyer for Lawrenceville Historical Society's events.
You have monthly talks as well. So the flyers are over there, the books are over there. Did you want to say how much, or?
The Arsenal book is $20, the Landmarks of Lawrenceville $13, and the Orphan book $20.
Okay, so thank you so much. And last thing, the chairs, I'm getting the signal from Audrey. If you just bring your chair up, you can stack it there, and our crew will take it from there. So thank you so much for coming.